Good evening. I'm Peter Kern, the Director of the Global Public Health Program, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our Global Public Health Lecture Series, which is co-sponsored by the Institute for Health and Humanities, and with a grant from Montana Community Access Television, allows us to produce videotapes of these lectures and then put them on our website, in case we know other people who wish they could have been here tonight. And also, I'd like to ask you if you're either a student or a non-student, I guess you could say, to sign in on the sheets that we have there, so we can kind of get an idea of who's come and keep in touch with you about other talks that are coming up and so forth. But there's another reason why you want to do that, and that is we have a raffle this year for one copy of my book. And so we are going to raffle that off the last night of the lecture series. And the more times you attend, the more chances you're going to have to win the book. We're going to put the number of attendances into the hat when we draw that out. So do sign up with your email address as well. So tonight, I'm very happy to invite you to what promises to be a really interesting and valuable lecture in terms of global health. Darren Bell's going to talk about environmental and human health in terms of Western Borneo. This is a place we have not yet heard from in this lecture series, so we're really looking forward to that, even though we've been doing this now for about 5 years. Darren is an MD. He works with UM's Family Medicine Residency in Western Montana, and he's particularly interested in rural and underserved communities, overseas medicine, and wilderness and remote medicine. So that's a pretty big package there that he's focused on in his career. He's organized several medical volunteer trips to Africa and to Southeast Asia, and that's where he has witnessed the relationship between the environment and health, which he's going to talk about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Darren Bell to the lecture series tonight.
Thank you. Is this mic on? No, doesn't look like it is. How do I get this mic to turn on? Do I need it? Can you hear me okay?
It came on there.
It came on? Okay, it is on? Okay, I can't tell.
I don't think so.
No?
There's a little red light on it. On? Oh, yeah, you have to hold it apparently. Or green light. You're good.
How about now? That sounds better. Okay, good. All right, well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to try not to stand in front of the slides, and since we don't have a remote thing, I've got to stand over here kind of close to the computer so I can change the slides over. This one, unfortunately, it has a little key fob so that I could remotely do it, but I just brought it for the laser pointer and didn't have the little fob. So we're gonna work around our technology issues throughout the day. So as Peter mentioned, I work with the Family Medicine Residency. As part of my job with the residency program, I oversee our global health curriculum. My wife works in the physical therapy program as well, and the two of us have been helping to organize the annual College of Health Professions overseas global health interprofessional trip that goes on every year for the last several years. And last year we had the opportunity to go back to Borneo with a group of physical therapy students, pharmacy students, public health students, and family medicine residents. This was Jen's and my second trip to Borneo, and so a lot of this information that we're going to be talking about is based on a combination of both of those trips that we had been on, but trying to focus a little more on what happened this last time. There will be another group from the College of Health Professions going to Borneo again this August, and the plan is to recurrently go back to this same site. So, that being said, the whole point of this and the idea behind this lecture is not to give you a travel log of what we did in Borneo, but more to use that as kind of a point to, as a point of contact, a point of reference to discuss more globally, if you will, the impacts of environmental health on human health, how they're related to each other, and some of the issues that can arise when either one of them tends to go awry. So to start, this has been an issue that's been known about, the relationship between environmental health and human health, since basically the dawn of modern medicine. This is from the writings of Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but if you notice, he talks about considering the seasons of the year, the heat, the cold, the winds, the waters, the ground. He has a whole treatise. The book is on airs, waters, and places, and their relation to health. So from the get-go, there's been an awareness that what is happening environmentally affects what happens in terms of an individual's health. So today, as we go through this talk, I want to use Borneo and where we were as a case study to kind of look at and get a bigger, broader picture of that relationship. We're going to start by looking at a little bit of the historical perspective, look some at modern problems as societies have developed and environmental issues that are going on, and then see how the developing world differs from the United States or the Western world in general. Specific ways that the environment affects people's health, and then approaches to try and solve some of the problems that come up as a result of environmental issues when it comes to human health. This is a slide-heavy presentation. I have been informed I tend to talk a lot. If anybody has any questions at any point in time, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, jump up and down, shout at me, whatever. But otherwise, I'll just carry through. I've also been told that I talk really fast, so if it's going too fast and you want to stop and talk a little bit more about something, let me know as well. So, first of all, where is Borneo? It is the third largest island in the world. It's in the South China Sea. That's assuming you count Australia as a continent and not an island. Greenland and Papua New Guinea are the only two islands that are bigger than it. It is primarily constructed, or it's divided into three countries, but the bulk of the land is actually in Indonesia. Malaysia has part of it, and then the entirety of the Sultanate of Brunei is located in the small northern border there. This is where we were, in a little tiny town called Sukadana. It's a town of about 4,000-ish people with a surrounding community, a surrounding population of somewhere around 24,000 or so, and that's probably, I would give it about the diameter of that circle in that region there. Borneo is primarily known for people who know it at all. A lot of people just know it by name. Most people have heard the name Borneo, but for people who know about it, they think of wildlife in general. It's known for a lot of biodiversity, a whole lot of amazing animals. Kingfishers and hornbills, monitor lizards. This is a relative of a crocodile, and then a bearded pig here. Most of these pictures, I think there are only a couple that weren't taken by myself or somebody in our traveling party while on one of these two trips. So lots and lots of things that are going on in this area wildlife-wise, but primarily what people know Borneo for are monkeys. There are macaques, gibbons, proboscis monkeys, red-leaf monkeys, whole lots of monkeys, but the ones that people really know are the orangutans. Just a side note, as I have been scolded by several people who study orangutans, there is no G on the end of the word. It's not orangutans. It's orangutans or orangutans. Apparently I was incorrect in that, so I thought I'd pass on that tidbit of information. It comes from Malay or Bahasa Indonesia, the Indonesian language, which are both based on the same root language. Orang means person and hutan means forest. So these are people of the forest. Orangutans only live in Borneo. That's the only place that you will find them. And their habitat has been under threat for some time. There's also been a huge problem with orangutan poaching, taking them into captivity, and things like that. So most of these pictures of the orangutans that you're going to see in here come from Tanjung Puting National Park, which is a Rehabilitation and release center for orangutans. So when they take in illegally captured orangutans from people's homes or circuses or wherever they get them from, then they'll try and rehabilitate them and release them back out to this national park. All over the park they have signs like this, because since it's a captured orangutan release center, most of the animals there don't have a good sense of how to forage in the wild. So they're heavily reliant on people. They have feeding stations throughout the park where twice a day they go out and put out large supplies of bananas and sweetened milk, and orangutans will just come swinging in from the trees to get their food because they're not very good at figuring out how to manage without. Now the hope is that with subsequent generations they'll begin to reacquire those skills to figure out how to forage on their own. But in the meantime, this is what has to be done to keep them going. As a result of these being rehabilitated orangutans, many of whom tended to have been in captivity or around people a lot, they're very accustomed to people. And so you end up with orangutans that are very comfortable getting up close and personal to people. This is a female orangutan, which we were told at the park that they are 8 times as strong as an average adult male human and have the ability, when angered, to rip off limbs if necessary, which all sounds well and good unless you're posing by one of these things for a picture and your brother, who happens to be there, thinks it'd be a great idea to make a sound very similar to an orangutan distress call, and it turns around and takes a swing at you. Then it's not quite so entertaining anymore. But they also have problems with things like this. So this was our guide on one of our trips, just sitting there on a thing with his backpack, and the orangutan decided, that's a backpack. The people who bring in the bananas and bring in the milk bring them in large backpacks and set them down on these feeding stations. So his assumption was that there was food and things in that backpack. So he comes up and starts trying to get into them. So they have lots of warnings, they have lots of protection. The second time we went there, the orangutans didn't get anywhere near as close, so the management seems to be getting a little bit better with regards to the orangutans. But this is what the area is pretty much known for. We were not working right around Tanjung Puting. We were actually working near another national park that's called Gunung Palung. This is also an orangutan preserve, but they do not reintroduce orangutans into the wild here. This is the Clinic Osri. The first time we went, it was a little house that was converted. We'll have some more pictures of that here in a little bit. And this hillside right behind it is Gunung Palung National Park. The second trip, this was the clinic. They had built a clinic that extends back. You'll see some more pictures of that they're in the process of trying to turn into a hospital. They have to get licensed to be able to have patients overnight. But they have a very nice setup with surgical suites, a birthing center. They have an isolation room out in the back, a separate building to keep people who need to be in isolation for active tuberculosis or other things along those lines out back. It's a super nice facility. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that near more toward the end of the presentation. But before we get into the sorts of things that we were doing to address this whole issue, let's look at environmental and human health from a bit of a historical perspective. So clearly, we're all products of our environment. We all interact with our environment on a daily basis and have since the dawn of time. And so if we go back and look from the beginning of history, hunter-gatherer civilizations, what would have been the impacts that their environment would have had on their health as hunter-gatherers? Any thoughts? No thoughts whatsoever. Yes?
Hunting of animals.
Yep, absolutely.
Large, dangerous.
Yeah, contact with dangerous animals. What would be the number one thing that will kill you fastest if you're stuck out in the wild somewhere? Any ideas? Yeah. Exposure. So absolutely. If you're a hunter-gatherer society, you don't have any form of permanent shelter or permanent housing. Exposure is going to be a huge thing that's going to impact your health, depending on what the weather does, depending on where the food supplies are. What's the next thing that's going to kill you after exposure? Water. Water's number 2. So, water supplies. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you're having to wander around trying to find where the food sources are. Food sources aren't necessarily going to always correlate directly with clean water supplies. And so there's going to be an issue associated with water. The third thing is food, which I've mentioned a couple of times now. Who knows what you're going to find? Theoretically, you get very good at figuring out where food supplies are going to be, what types of foods are going to be there, but it's going to depend seasonally as to what you're going to have available to you. It's going to depend on where you are at any given point in time as to whether there are things growing that you can pick, whether you're going to have to track down and hunt down your food. So the things that primarily put your health at risk as a hunter-gatherer are entirely and 100% environmentally dependent. So from the get-go, there's a clear connection between how the environment relates to your health as a human being. On the flip side, as hunter-gatherers move through the environment and are able to gather their food, move on, the environment is also very easily able to compensate for them. A band of people moves through, the environment does what it does and has done for millennia. It regrows, it rebuilds, it fixes whatever issues may have come up, but it resupplies. So you pick all the fruits off of a tree, the tree grows more fruits the next year, that sort of thing. Then you develop agriculture. So we're going to continue to look at these primary issues toward health for a little bit, but with agriculture, all of a sudden you're reducing a huge environmental stressor. You have a permanent or recurrent or stable food source. So this is one of the big three. It's kind of taken care of for people. At the same time, when you have agriculture, you have to be around some sort of water supply in general. And usually you're going to try and set up your shop around clean water, good water, so that you can grow your plants. If you have livestock that goes along with it so that they can have that. So that kind of takes care of those two things. However, when you're modifying your environment for agriculture, the environment has a harder time compensating for the human impacts when it's there. So these are some fields that we were trekking past in Papua, in Indonesian Papua on the first trip that we went. These were all terraced, all up and down a hillside. This hillside used to be forested, and now it's completely denuded and has been for who knows how long because of agriculture as people have settled in the area. But along with agriculture, you can also get shelter, permanent shelters and settlements. So all of a sudden you're not so subject to cold weather, to rain, to wind, to whatever shelters you can find or happen to be able to carry with you. You can build things that are more substantial. You can build huts. You can have fires in them. You can keep them warm. There are lots of things that you can do. However, along with this comes a new set of environmental problems. The big three killers, exposure, water, and food, may be kind of taken care of. But now if you're sitting in a hut and you've got a fire keeping you warm, what's another issue that you have to deal with in terms of your health? Yeah, air quality. So all of a sudden air, which is pretty much a granted anywhere you go unless you're buried alive and or drowning, all of a sudden it could potentially cause problems. Now when you're first talking about the introduction of agriculture, this isn't necessarily a huge deal. There are so many things, both environmentally and otherwise, that are going to kill you before bad air becomes a big issue for you. You can probably learn to deal with that. But again, as people start to settle down, the impacts on the environment, on their local immediate environment, become greater. It becomes harder and harder for the environment to compensate. Another issue associated with settling in place with regard to the food is how do you store it? When you're a hunter-gatherer, you can move with the seasons, with the food sources to the next spot. If you're tied to one location, what do you do in between when the crops are harvested? How do you keep meat fresh if you go out and hunt something or you have livestock? This can be a real challenge. So this poses a whole new set of health problems, preventing food from spoiling and preventing it from causing you sickness and illness. In this first trip, we actually came upon a hut that in a village very much like this, where they'd caught a monitor lizard, and they'd hog-tied it, all four of its limbs tied together, and set it in a side room. And we're like, why are you doing that? And they said, we don't need to eat it today. And if we kill it, it won't be any good by the time we need to eat it tomorrow. So they just kept the animal tied up and alive for another few days until they actually needed the food. So people come up with solutions to deal with the new problems that are developing as they modify their environment. With shelter, with agriculture, with permanent settlement comes villages and increased population density. This brings with it a whole new set of environmental issues. More people in one area, what do you need more of? Food, water, shelter. All of these things that you've been developing, you end up needing to increase the quantity to sustain the increased people because there's a permanence to it. And so the strain on the environment continues to grow again and again and again. In addition, once you've got a large settlement of people and their livestock, you end up with an increased quantity of waste that you have to deal with as well. Waste brings a whole new set of environmental challenges to human health. So, what do you do if you need to go to the bathroom? Anybody, what do you do if you need to go to the bathroom? You go to the bathroom. What happens to it? Do you just go poop in your yard? I hope not. My toddlers sometimes do. I'm trying to discourage that. No, you go into a bathroom, it's got a nice porcelain toilet sitting there full of water, you flush the toilet and everything goes away. So we've got systems in place to manage waste, but when you're living in a village like this, you don't have those sorts of systems. So what do? In some cases, you dig a latrine and you have pit toilets, which is a very good way to handle it, but in a lot of cases you don't. And historically that hasn't always been the case. You go find a tree, you go find a corner of the field, you go in the cover of darkness and take care of what you need to take care of. And there it sits. And whatever diseases are running around inside your gastrointestinal tract are sitting there waiting to get on your crops, waiting to be tracked around by the livestock, waiting for someone else to come wandering through the same area, and then pick them up and continue the cycle. So you get a whole new set of issues and illnesses that come up as a result of just the presence of waste around and the lack of a waste management system. After villages and permanent settlements, you start to get modernization. Modernization brings all sorts of nice things, including that running water, which can take your wastes away as far as the individual is concerned. But it brings up a whole new set of challenges. So, construction materials. It's kind of dark here, you can't really see very well. This is a nice blue house. This is actually a fairly orange house. You get things like lead in your paint, which can potentially be toxic. You get things like, as anybody who's been paying attention to the news around here, asbestos in your buildings, which can cause all sorts of problems down the road for people as well. So new building materials, new construction brings with it better protection from the elements, brings with it all sorts of comforts and all sorts of benefits, but you get a whole new set of challenges. In addition, when you're building massive roadways and you have industries developing right alongside your rivers, you get runoff, you get industrial contamination. You can actually contaminate and cause problems with your water supplies, with the arable land to grow crops on a much, much larger scale than you do otherwise. So with each step you get benefits, but there are also drawbacks in terms of that relationship. When we went on our first trip, we left from San Francisco and flew to Singapore before heading down to Indonesia. What do you notice in both of these pictures? Lights. There are lots and lots of lights here. How did those lights get there? People aren't burning candles in all of those windows. It requires lots and lots of power, lots of electricity. So now we start getting even broader scale, bigger issues, and environmental impacts. How do you provide all the power for all of the people to have all of the lights to live in these nice new modern cities? You solve some of the problems. The running water in both of these locations is drinkable. I kind of view Singapore as kind of like Southeast Asia light. It's a really good introduction. You get some of it, but you can still drink the water. You have modern conveniences, nice roadways, and traffic jams and all that sort of stuff. But you have all of the problems that go along with that. So all of a sudden you're damming up rivers to produce hydroelectric power, or you're burning coal, and you have lots more environmental impacts, lots more health consequences associated with those things. And according to some, this would kind of be the apex type of civilization, where everything is clean and friendly and wonderful all the time. This is Disneyland. Have any of you been to Disneyland? I see a couple of hands rising up. Disneyland's a magical place. It's absolutely magnificent, as long as you've had your measles immunization. So there are a whole new set of problems that can arise, even when you get kind of the epitome of what modern society can produce. Just having people around in close proximity to each other at all times can cause a whole lot of other problems. Measles outbreak that happened 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, in Disneyland was a great example of that. The other issue with this is, of course, this is artificial. It works great on a small scale, but you still have the same issues with modern cities. It just has to be taken care of somewhere else. Those problems tend to leak over. This is not a permanent long-term solution. So now let's step back to the developing world, because the developing world is kind of in an interesting situation. So if you go travel in West Kalimantan in Borneo to Sukadana or the surrounding communities like we did, you see a lot of interesting modern conveniences, but you also see a lot of the same issues and problems from historical times that are still carrying through. So you see things like really poor shelter. There's nothing between these slats on these buildings. Air, wind, and critters go right through. So it provides some protection from rain primarily, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of protection. Mosquitoes can fly right in with their mosquito-borne illnesses. You see a lot of nice roads, fantastic new modern condominium complexes. These are all built for swallows, because this is where they harvest their nests for bird's nest soup in China. It's a huge market seen all over Western Borneo. This is more like what you see in bigger, more developed areas in Western Kalimantan. You see a lot of kind of variable housing and construction right on top of each other, with a whole lot of traffic, primarily motorbikes that are extremely loud and for the most part extremely smoky and smell really terrible going through here. So this brings all of the same problems that you have from having lots and lots of people together, but doesn't provide a lot of the benefits. They do have running water to remove their wastes. They don't have potable running water. A lot of people don't have access to running water at all, and so there's still a lot of defecation in yards and under the cover of darkness. A lot of people are using water out of the gutters, out of the runoff channels, to bathe their kids in. All of that is fraught with difficulties and challenges in terms of health, just because there are so many people around and so many contaminants that get into that. Waste and sanitation is a huge issue. As you get more modern, people get lots and lots of things that come in nice plastic packages. There isn't a whole lot of ways to deal with that anywhere in the world, much less in the developing world. There isn't a whole lot of sanitation workers or availability of even trash collection. There was a huge shift when we were in Sukadana the first time, and the second time they've made some significant efforts. The first time we were there 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, the ground was just littered everywhere along the beach, along the roadways was just littered with plastic packaging from foodstuffs. People would just throw it out the side. There was nothing else to do with it. You could either throw it out the side or you could burn it in your yard. Those were pretty much the two options. Now they have giant dumpsters stationed at various points throughout the city where people can take it, and there is significantly less litter on the side of the road, but the dumpsters are just overflowing. They almost never get hauled off, almost never get emptied. And so it's just shifting the problem. There's very little in terms of human waste processing plants. So it gets washed away out of the toilet. Who knows where it goes? They don't have a whole lot of mechanisms in place, not a lot of infrastructure to help deal with the issue on a bigger scale. And so it, in large part, either gets dumped in waterways or dumped into the ocean, which leads to its own set of problems in terms of food supplies and fresh water and clean water and that sort of thing. They tend to have some modern conveniences like food that tends to remove them from their food sources a little bit. So this is good and bad in a couple of ways. There's very little regulation, but people generally have fairly good access to food, assuming they can afford it. However, Regulation, as an example, this is the place 2 hours away, the little shop where we would go in Katapong to buy all of our coffee, because it was the only coffee that we could see the whole beans and then grind it before us so that we could know what we were getting, as opposed to other places where it was very common to cut it with rice, and who knows what other fillers that happened to be brown that got put into the coffee as well. Which is interesting, because Java is the island where Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, happens to be. Java has a very distinct connotation here in the United States as a coffee kind of place. But you cannot get decent coffee in West Kalimantan, and you have no guarantee of its safety when you do go for it. Farmers markets like this are all over the place. This is from the little farmers market just down the street from where we were staying in Sukadana. So you do have lots of people who are bringing in their goods to sell so that people can buy it and have access in the communities. But people aren't entirely removed from their food supply. This was a cow being slaughtered in the front yard as we were walking past. People walking around on the blue tarp with their bare feet. This is a farmer's market in Papua where it's just littered with trash, dust, dirt everywhere. Lots of cars streaming past right here. Pollution, smoke, exhaust coming out all over the place. So there are clearly still problems with that and issues that could come up in terms of health because of the way the food supply is run. This was a goat that apparently someone was selling a goat in our front yard one day. We're not entirely sure why the transaction was happening in our front yard, but we heard a lot of squawking and went out and they were hog-tying the goat and putting it on a motorbike. Along with development, though, comes a lot of the modern conveniences. This was the plastics store that would come around about once or twice a month. Motorbike just absolutely loaded up with whatever you needed. Plastic scoops, plastic strainers, plastic buckets, plastic shovels, you name it. Plastic beach balls, whatever you needed, he had it. This is great, but as we all know, plastics don't break down. So you ended up with a lot of broken plastic scoops, a lot of broken plastic strainers and shovels and beach balls. But then what do they do with them? They end up just littering them, throwing them on the sides of the road. Now they're putting more of them in the dumpsters, but where do they go? It continues to cause problems. One of the benefits of modernity, of development, is the advent and development of modern medicine, which has helped to solve a lot of the health problems that tend to come up. This is in the airport in Jakarta. What do you notice about this AED stand? There's no AED in it. It's an empty stand. There should be a machine sitting right here. They have access to some of what we take for granted here in the United States, but a lot of it is a token response, or they have something that's there for a little while, but it's not really consistent. And so this is a huge issue in terms of health in the developing world, is the environment has changed and they've developed a lot of the problems that go along with it, diabetes and lung disease and heart disease and that sort of thing, but they don't have access to the medicines that have been developed and the treatments that have been developed to help address some of these issues. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly so that we're not straying too far behind. But basically, if you're looking at the impacts that the environment can have on human health, you can kind of break it down into three primary categories. One is the direct impacts that the environment can have on your health. So this is things like pollution. We talked about fires inside your hut. This was in a hut on one of our treks where they invited the women folk in to help cook as all of the guys sat around and drank coffee and stared at each other for the most part, mostly because I think there were 3 males of lighter skin color, and that was just fascinating to all of the people in this little village. So all of the males in the village came and stared at us while the ladies all went and cooked. But this place just filled up with smoke inside this. They do have a little hole in the top of the ceiling for the smoke to come out, but it does very, very little in terms of actually siphoning the smoke up and out. And so the place just fills with smoke. Asthma rates are extremely high in children in some of these smaller, less developed areas because of indoor cooking fires. You can see the smoke and haze it's kind of dark in this picture. You can see the haze in among the trees here. It makes for amazing sunrises, but it's causing all sorts of health problems with people as well. So these are kind of the direct effects. Other direct effects would be other things that you would get from exposure to environment. We talked about mosquitoes flying right in through the sides of your building that you're staying in. Wild animals can come walking through and can cause problems. You're subject to flooding, landslides, lightning strikes, all sorts of things that we just don't tend to think about for the most part here, unless you live in Southern California after a wildfire. So you do get some of that in modern areas. We haven't been able to attenuate it completely, but these tend to be much bigger problems on a grander scale in the developing world. There are also environmentally mediated effects. So these are things like this section of deforestation, which is just swampy, useless land at this point in time. This is absolutely a haven, a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can then pick up diseases and transmit them to other people. The trash that's littering the sides of the roads or in the dumpsters attracts in wildlife. Wildlife bring in their own set of problems. So these are things that the environment does not directly cause, but provides the right setup to have issues and impacts on health. And then there's the indirect effects. And so this was a group of young men that were just sitting along the side of the trail as we were trekking one day. We tried talking with them. A couple of the people on our trip could speak Indonesian, and really they were just kind of hanging out. They had nothing to do. There were no jobs. There was nothing for them to do in general. So you use up resources. You don't have the ability to recreate them and replace them. There's lots of displacement issues if people don't have resources available, or if there are wars or conflict, people end up moving around, tend to end up in highly concentrated, very impoverished locations like migrant camps and things like that. There's stress-related illnesses that come from not being able to get adequate nutrition, despite the fact that you live in a relatively developed area. And so there are lots of things that go along that are kind of indirectly impacted by the environment. According to the World Health Organization, these are 2006 statistics, 1/4 of deaths globally are secondary to modifiable environmental risk factors. 1/3 of childhood deaths and 88% of diarrheal illnesses, as well as 42% of all causes of malaria and 95% of the cases of dengue fever, dengue hemorrhagic fever, are all directly or indirectly related to modifiable environmental factors. So this is not a small problem that we're talking about. If we're talking about 1/4 of all the people in the world who die due to environmental issues, that's not a little issue that and a little thing that we're talking about. So this is a schematic of Borneo from 1950 through predicted 2020. I pulled this slide several years ago, so the prediction 2020, I haven't actually gone and verified how that looks. The dark green is forests. Borneo is one of the largest areas of contiguous old-growth rainforest in the world. And you can see 1985, 2000, and on upward, how the forests have become smaller and smaller and smaller. Where we were working was right here, this little tiny pocket of green, which theoretically through 2020, and I can verify that at least as of 2018, is still this little tiny pocket of green. That's Gunung Palung National Park. That's the national park that's been set aside, and so as a result, it's been able to maintain, but you can see, I mean, compared to the entire island, essentially, was rainforest. Now there's very little of it that is that case. This is what a healthy rainforest looks like. This is what it tends to look like in much of the island now. Why is this? Any ideas? Logging. Why would people be logging? Yep, export. So there are three primary reasons. One is cheap lumber. It's so that we can have our plywood. So a lot of the logs get shipped down rivers, get bought up by Chinese lumber companies and turned into plywood and used either in China or shipped back to the Western world for use. So that's a lot of it. Another big issue is this. Palm plantations. Very, very lucrative for a small number of people. All of those things you buy in the store that say they contain palm oil, they come from palm plantations like this. The other thing is slash and burn agriculture. You can see the smoke These ladies have walked a day and a half. They've got about another day and a half to get back to their village. They walk into town. They sell off all of their produce that they're growing in their village. They buy kerosene for their chainsaws and generators, and they buy ramen. I cannot tell you the number of women that we saw walk past with these things strapped over their head, and their backs were just full of ramen packets. Plastic packets of cheap, high-calorie, low nutritional value foods. They sell off the things that they're growing and buy this because they can get more calorie-wise than they can from growing it themselves. These hillsides, like I said earlier, are completely denuded of green life. They used to be all forests. They're now primarily either completely barren or they've got these little scrubby things in their place. This has a huge impact on people. So, what do we do? Well, before we get into what we do, so here's some of the consequences of that. Some of the issues that come up with that is clearly if you take a rainforest that covers the third largest island in the world and you break it up to this tiny little spots, all the wildlife and animals and biodiversity that's living there loses its habitat. So there are a few little pockets of orangutans. Gunung Palung National Park that I told you about has 10% of the world population of orangutans left. It's a tiny little pocket. I'll show you again here in just a second. Tiny little pocket of forest. So there's that issue. The biodiversity is another issue. Who knows what benefits we could find from all of these various plants and animals and fungal species that we haven't even categorized yet. If you go looking for, as I did when I was trying to identify some of the animals in some of these pictures, looking for websites that say just the types of reptiles in Borneo, they all have disclaimers saying, these are the ones that we know about, these are the ones that have been cataloged, but there are so many things that people don't even realize that are out there, and who knows what benefits those are going to have for us in the long run, particularly when you're thinking about medicinal type things. So once again, Gunung Palung National Park, 10% of the entire world's population of orangutans live in that park. They used to have basically free reign of this entire island. But when you get them isolated out like this, they do not travel anywhere else to any of these other areas. So we've got a very, very small habitat left for the wildlife. But there are also big issues in terms of what does this mean toward some of the bigger planetary issues? If you're taking away this many trees, what do you think that does in terms of carbon dioxide levels? This is a huge carbon sink that was here. It's no longer available for sequestration of carbon. And so all of the natural resources that we have in availability to help reverse some of the changes that we see leading toward global climate change are disappearing. And they're disappearing at an amazingly rapid rate. Local issues become a big problem as well. So when you take a river like this surrounded by trees, this is hugely beneficial for the entire environmental area around there. So as with most equatorial and tropical areas, they don't really have summer, winter, spring, fall like we do here. They tend to have dry seasons and rainy seasons. When you get monsoons that come through, they just absolutely saturate the ground. We were walking through Tanjung Puching Park and it started raining on us and it opened up, and within the space of about 15 minutes before we could make it back to shelter, we were walking through water this deep on the trails. It just becomes ridiculous how much water flows through there. Well, what happens to all that water? In a situation like this, there's a lot of space, a lot of arable area between the roots of trees and the roots of plants within the soil, so the soil can hold a whole lot more water. There's a lot of moisture that gets held in by the roots themselves. And then throughout the dry season, that's slowly released back out into the soils and comes to nice little channeled rivers like this. When it looks like this, that's not so much the case. The rains come through, you get massive runoff, it strips all the land of the topsoil where you can grow anything, and you don't have any retention for the dry season whatsoever. In addition, you get these little puddles where you can get lots of mosquito breeding, which can help spread malaria and dengue fever and other mosquito-borne illnesses. So lots and lots of environmental impacts, both local as well as more global, as a result of the deforestation. So what do we do about it? This is one organization's approach that I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about now. This is the organization that we traveled through and continue to go back and work with. Health in Harmony is the umbrella organization, the United States NGO, that helps work with Clinic ASRI. ASRI stands for Alam Sehat Lestari, which in Indonesian, I had to write it down because I never remember. It's Healthy, Natural, Sustainable, or Healthy Nature Everlasting. When they shorten it down to their acronym ASRI, that is also a word that means in Indonesian, beautiful or harmoniously balanced. So they have this nice little, both the full name and the shortened name, kind of spoke to what they were trying to accomplish with this particular clinic. So with this particular organization, this was set up by an Indonesian dentist and an American doctor. The doctor went to Indonesia as a graduate student and was studying, I think it was orangutans in Tanjung Puting, or I'm sorry, in Gunung Palung National Park, there in Sukadana. As she was there, she realized that one of the biggest issues that people had in the area was access to health care. So they set up these processes where they went around to groups of villagers, both in Sukadana and in the surrounding villages, and asked them why there was so much logging going on in the area, because this was directly impacting the orangutan habitat in the national park. A lot of illegal logging going on within the park itself. So they went around and asked them why, and the primary reason they said was it's the only source of income we have. And so anytime there's a family emergency, we can go out and fell a tree or two, float them down the river and sell them, and then we can pay for whatever healthcare needs. There's also a lack of other ways to make money for general life needs, food, etc., education, etc. And so the grad student then said, okay, well, I'm going to go back to the United States and I'm going to go into medicine so that I can come back here and set up a clinic and try and help with that sort of issue. And so that's what she did, and founded both the Clinic ASRI and the Health in Harmony as parallel organizations. So the clinic has been set up with a dual purpose, and the purpose is to both provide for better health for the people of the area and to improve the environmental health as well. And so they've got a number of programs that I'm going to talk briefly about here that they try and do this. So healthcare in general in Indonesia is really, really poor. The medical training system is just full of corruption. There's lots and lots of stories about people paying to get into medical school, paying to pass examinations, paying to get to the next level of training and that sort of thing. So if they come from a wealthy family, people can get into and through medical school relatively easily. If they do not, they cannot get in. And there's not as much correlation with what they learn. There's also lots of stories about people taking money and not actually providing any education. And so people are kind of on their own to learn what they can. Now the healthcare providers, the doctors and nurses and therapists and dentists that we worked with are all extremely hardworking and some of the brightest people that I know, but there's part of the reason for that is because they have set up a system where part of the attraction to get Indonesian doctors to work in this clinic is that they guarantee that there will be, for a majority of the time, Western physicians who will teach them. And so when we went over, both times, most of what we were doing was actually helping Indonesian providers as they provided healthcare to patients and providing education on top of that. So we would talk about the cases and help formulate plans and how to deal with a certain situation, and then also providing lectures and also providing a series of other things, projects that get at bigger public health issues that they had in the area. This was the only procedural room that they had in the old clinic. This was one rusty bed that you can't really see scale here, but when we had to do any sort of procedures, like we were stitching up lacerations and things like that, I was usually kneeling on the floor beside the bed, and that would put me at just about the right height beside it. Doors were always open. Cats would wander in and out. At one point, we were stitching up someone's finger, and I looked down, and there was an ant crawling down my arm toward my sterile gloves, and I'm like, I'm not exactly sure how to get rid of that without breaking sterility, so I'm like trying to shake it off and that sort of thing. This is in their new clinic. This is their obstetrical suite. Significant step up. It's still pretty Spartan, I mean, but they've got better equipment and space to do the things that they need. It's also very clean and kept very nice, which is great because the healthcare in the area is so poor that people flock to this clinic. There is a government clinic that people preferentially do not go to because they provide so much better care at this clinic, even though they have somewhat limited resources as dictated by the government. People would come to this clinic from Katapong, 2 hours away, which had a regional hospital, because the reputation of care at this clinic was so much better than at the hospital in the community where they were living. As a result, we got to see all sorts of amazing off-the-wall things that you don't get to see in the United States. So they deal with all sorts of stuff. General health care, this is a scale. They're weighing a baby for a well child check, which was kind of cool. Leprosy, hadn't seen a whole lot of leprosy before. This is a sputum smear, which you can't really see on this slide, but there are acid-fast bacilli in there, which indicates tuberculosis. So active TB coming through fairly regularly. This particular gentleman, you may be able to see that this is the back of his knee, and it seems to be hinged in the wrong direction. It's actually fused straight, but he fell off of his motorcycle 2.5 years prior to coming in, and his knee just fused because he couldn't get health care. And the bone that was sticking out on the backside had actually ulcerated his skin, and so that's why he came in to get care at this particular point in time. This gentleman came in on our last trip. We don't know what was going on here. We assume it was cancer. Kind of hard to tell. We didn't have any mechanism of getting any sort of biopsy. We offered to send him down to the clinic or to the hospital 2 hours away, but they couldn't afford it. So he was debating with his family as to whether they were going to actually go down there or whether he was just going to go home with the Tylenol, which is basically what we had in terms of pain medication to help keep him more comfortable. But he came in because he was finally having enough problems swallowing that they decided they ought to get this checked out. At this point, we're not going to be able to do much for him. And we had to have that part of that conversation with him, because even if he went down and did get a definitive diagnosis, there's probably not a whole lot that could be done for him at that point anyway. Had he had access to modern healthcare earlier, maybe this could have been caught earlier. Maybe something could have been done in an earlier state. But there are lots of problems to that, which we're going to talk about a little bit. So one of the ways that they're trying to address this at Clinic Ossory is they have A, discounted healthcare, B, if you come from a village in the surrounding area around the national park that has agreed as a whole village to stop logging in the park, and there are no loggers, and they have people who are assigned that are actually paid from Clinic Ossory to monitor the village for logging activity, then you get even more discounted health care. If you don't have the ability to pay for health care, every clinic, every hospital in the country, you have to pay when you go into the clinic. If you don't have the ability to pay here, they'll take your handicrafts and then sell them in their gift shop. They'll take seedlings for their reforestation projects. They'll take rice husks and animal manure to help with some organic gardening projects that they have going on. And you can also work. You can work in their organic gardens or work around the hospital to help pay off your bill. Yeah?
Wondering if you just do a general outline of what prices are in US dollars for common procedures.
Common procedures I don't really have a good estimate of, but for medications, for example, well, actually, here's a good one. So checking a point of care glucose, just a finger stick like a glucometer that any diabetic would have and check their point of care glucose, costs $3 in Indonesia to get it done, which is cost prohibitive to most people. So we had people who came into the hospital with diabetic ketoacidosis, which in the United States, you would send to the ICU, you would have them on an insulin drip, you would be checking their blood sugars at least hourly and adjusting the amount of sugar you're putting in their IV and adjusting the insulin that you're giving them on a moment-by-moment basis. Here, when people came in with the same problem, they would give them a shot of long-lasting insulin, have them eat and drink what they could, and check their blood sugars once a day because of that cost, of that $3 cost to check the blood sugars there. So that's kind of an example. So prices of some of the drugs that they would get were actually relatively inexpensive. You could get Tylenol or aspirin for, they would sell them by the pill, and so they were usually in the range, I want to say, a nickel, 10 cents a pill, something like that, which is relatively similar if we probably priced out what we're paying here in the United States. But for people who are living on average less than $13 a month, that's a huge amount of money for them to have to pay for things. And so price is a big issue when it comes to actually receiving health care. These are the organic gardens that they had out back.
How do the costs compare with the public clinic?
Same price. Same price in general. So they have discounted it for people who are in the villages, but things like the drugs are all provided by the government, and the government dictates the price. So they don't have actually a whole lot of flexibility on that. They can change the price in terms of the actual medical visits, the doctor's visits and the dental visits and things like that, but they can't do a whole lot for some of the other things along those lines. Oh, this was another thing, another benefit that they provided to the surrounding communities. So another huge issue was access to healthcare was just the transportation. So if you live in a village that's, 10, 20 kilometers away, that may not seem that far. We're talking 5 to 10 miles, essentially. That may not seem like a huge issue, but for some of these people, it was really, really challenging if you don't have transportation to get there. So they set up these mobile clinics where once a month they'll go out to villages, they'll load up a whole bunch of medical gear into the back of a truck, and then they'll drive out to mobile clinics for these villages that have agreed to stop logging. So they bring the healthcare to the people on a regular, recurrent basis, as opposed to making people come in. This characterizes why transportation may be a challenge. So this is driving out to one mobile clinic on our first trip. So we started out on fairly decent roads with fairly decent bridges. They quickly became worse and worse and worse until we're traveling through things like this. If you don't have anything but a motorbike in your family, or you don't even have that, navigating through territory like this to get into a clinic poses a real barrier to people. Transportation is a huge access issue. How do you get health care if you can't reach it?
I have a question.
Yes?
Do you have any native healers?
They do. So they have a variety. Primarily the ones that are most often seen are midwives and bone setters. And bone setters are their own special breed of healers, and they tend to be people with other jobs, but they have special training in setting bones, and the special training is just handed down by word of mouth. And it usually involves wrapping a broken bone with special herbs and saying incantations over it and then leaving it wrapped. There isn't actually a whole lot of resetting fractures and making sure that they're in proper alignment and that sort of thing. So, which is why you end up with knees like that one that we saw, which was really fused. Now that one probably wouldn't have been fixed by just resetting the bone. That probably needed surgery to begin with. But those are the two primary things. There is less and less of other traditional medicine in the area. There are some people who people will go to primarily to get herbal remedies and things for various things, but it mostly remains in families. There maybe in a local neighborhood there might be someone who has a little more knowledge of the medicinal plants of the area, and people will go seek their advice, but not as much of this is the person that we go to for health, except for the midwives and the bone setters. So this is just an example of a mobile clinic.
Midwives have government-sponsored training, or is it
Mostly lay midwives. So there are a handful of nurse midwives. There was one working for the clinic, but it's mostly lay midwives. You'd set up the mobile clinics in a house or a school or something like that, and then you'd spend several days seeing patients and trying to provide them with treatments. But when you go to some of these remote areas, you see some amazing things. You see people with strokes that haven't been treated or seen in years. You see things like this, which we're, again, assuming was a cancer. This person died a few weeks after we saw this. They had a similar growth in their groin as well. But no access, no money, no way to get treated, no way to figure out what's going on until it looks like that. So other than the healthcare, the other purpose is to help with environmental health. This is reforestation projects. So we went out with on our last trip, the whole group of students who went out and helped reforest a hillside. This is an experimental reforestation plot where they were trying a number of different treatments to see what they could do to encourage the growth of hardwoods in a faster rate, because one of the problems is when you cut down all the old growth hardwoods, a bunch of scrub trees grow in that provide a whole bunch of cover, and hardwoods have a really hard time growing in, and it can take centuries for them to actually get a foothold again. And so they're trying to encourage that process so they can get more of an old growth forest with hardwoods growing up first. This is a nursery where they're growing a whole lot of seedlings, a lot of which have been provided either in the form of seedlings or in the form of seeds as payment for healthcare that people bring in. This is a bullion seed, which is an ironwood tree, which is one of the densest trees in the world that grows only in Borneo. I actually don't know any scientific name for it. They have training in animal husbandry. They have processes for providing animals to villages that they work with. These are community cows in one of the surrounding villages that were there solely to create poop. And then the poop would get turned into compost through a series that they trained people on how to do that. Then they could use that for organic gardening so that they wouldn't have to slash and burn more areas to have more places to grow crops. They could actually continue to use the same plots over and over and over again. So training like that. Organic gardening is a big thing that they work on. They train children as just after-school programs, middle-of-the-day programs, children that are running around in the streets. They'll have them come over, and they have a whole ASRI Kids program is what they call it, where they have a whole series of educational topics that they go through, and organic gardening is one of them. They were actually planting this organic garden in our front yard, which was kind of cool. And then this was an organic farmer that Osri had trained, and he had totally shifted his practice and was now actually doing quite well for himself, growing. You can see them back here behind. These are pepper plants. He decided he was going to grow pepper plants because nobody in the area grew pepper. And so he's now growing pepper and has a monopoly on the West Kalimantan pepper supply and sells it off and it gets shipped all around Indonesia for black pepper and does quite well. But he's using the same land over and over again through the techniques that Osri trained him. They have a Goats for Widows program. Widows have a really hard time bringing in any sort of income. Women typically don't work in the area, and if you haven't received any training in how to work, how to bring in any income, and then your husband dies, you could be a single mom and not have any way of getting income. So they will provide a widow with a goat, and then for the village it's a female goat that the widow gets, and then for the village they have a male goat that can mate with all the female goats of the village, and then she can sell off the kids that come from that goat. They're not a big dairy society. They don't really use them for dairy, cheese, and milk and that sort of thing. It's primarily for meat. The one requirement is that in the first 2 generations of kids that the goat has, she has to give one back to Clinic Osri. And then they use that to supply widows and further build and develop the program along those lines. This is their newest project that they just developed. This is the only clinic I've ever been to where they have a storeroom full of old chainsaws. They have a chainsaw buyback program. So if you are an illegal logger in the area, they will buy your chainsaw back from you, provide you with a loan to start up some new business if you have a business plan, and then provide you with business training to get that up and running off the ground so that you don't continue to log in the park. As a result, they've got quite an accumulation and growing of chainsaws that they're trying to figure out what to do with at this point in time. But this is fantastic. So this is the product of that. This is a little store in a village where she has, and her husband, who was not there at the time, who was the logger, they have supplies shipped out from one of the 2 grocery stores in town out to their little village, and then they resell it at a slight markup to people in the village so that they have income and people have more access to food. That's just an overview of the projects and programs. This is one program's solutions or attempts to take on this. There are clearly lots and lots of other discussions you could have in terms of how to tackle some of these challenges and issues, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. Health and Harmony is the organization that we went through. This is a really, really interesting article from the New York Times in 2015 that seemed to relate in an interesting way to how the how environment affects health, but how some of the things that people are doing to try and mitigate that can actually be problematic. We actually saw this when we were volunteering in Malawi, along Lake Malawi, lots and lots and lots of mosquito nets that people were using as fish nets instead of putting up over their beds at night. And so sometimes the best intentions can not actually work out the way that they're intended when set up. So that's pretty much all I had to say for this. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
Are the Western medical providers actually providing direct care in the clinics, or are they just advising the local doctors and health?
So Indonesia, in addition to being a developing country, is also one of the most bureaucratically heavy countries I have ever been to. And it is virtually impossible to get licensed to practice medicine in Indonesia unless you are trained in Indonesia. If you are living there full time, you potentially could, but it's really challenging and there's lots of issues that go along with that. So it's in an advising setting. No one is seeing patients on their own. They are paired up with Indonesian providers. And the goal was actually twofold. One, we're not allowed to see patients there, but two, it really is, the primary issue is not to have Western doctors coming over and providing care. The primary goal is to have Western doctors coming over and training Indonesian doctors who will then stay in Indonesia and the area and provide high quality care in the area. So no, you're not providing direct care. Now, what that means is basically you go in a room with a patient and an Indonesian doctor, they ask all the questions and then translate it into English for you, and then you both do an examination and then you talk about what a plan is and then they tell the patient. So it's a fine line, but yeah, technically it's the Indonesian doctors providing the care and you're providing consultation and education.
But occasionally in sterile gloves.
Occasionally in sterile, well, so if you have an Indonesian doctor who says, you've got a filleted finger and I don't know how to stitch this up, you come in and you put on your sterile gloves and you point, put a stitch there. Now put a stitch there. And sew them back together. Yes?
Is there any evidence of climate change or how that may affect the environment there?
So, yes and no. It's hard to tell. In the immediate area that we were in, not a whole lot. In a lot of the South Pacific islands, there is, as sea levels start to rise. Where we were, it was on the coast. There is a beach, but there hasn't been a huge issue in terms of direct effects that we can see so far. No. It's a tropical environment, so it's always hot. Whether it's getting hotter, who knows? Yeah.
Are the problems exactly the same in equatorial Africa compared to equatorial Asia?
Not exactly the same. The issues with access to healthcare tend to be very, very similar. So the volunteer trips I've done in Africa have been in Malawi and a couple of times in Ethiopia. They tend to have less issues in terms of, well, it depends regionally to a certain extent. So infectious diseases may vary a little bit depending on elevation and what mosquito-borne or other vector-borne illnesses are available in that area. It also depends largely on sanitation issues. So when you get out into truly rural areas, the access issues tend to be the same. The environmental issues with the relatively easy access to processed, unhealthy foods and plastic packaging tend to be exactly the same. The actual disease processes, and in some areas, the specific disease availability tends to differ, and it differs a little bit based on governments as well and politics in the region. So some places like Malawi has done an amazing job of getting HIV care out to the people of the country, because it's a huge 10% of the population of the country in Malawi has HIV. And so they've made a huge public health push to make available medications even in really remote areas. And so some issues like that you just don't really see. Here in Sukadana, they actually made a huge push to do some land cleanup, drain some swamps, provide some heavy investment in treatment for malaria to cut down the amount of malaria. And so the amount of malaria we saw the second time we were there was almost none compared to the first time we were there, where there was huge numbers of malaria. Malaria still tends to be a big problem in some of the lower areas in Africa. So similarities and a lot of overlap, but not exactly the same.
So with HIV and malaria, is that because there was a push with foreign money coming in, foundation money?
In large part, the HIV in Malawi, I know, has been in large part dependent on foreign monies. The malaria efforts in West Kalimantan, were not so much, other than indirectly. So it was government-funded efforts, but I don't know where the government was taking the money from in the first place. But it wasn't a direct push by foreign NGOs and things.
What have you learned from these trips that you would bring back here and use in your own teaching or practice or whatever?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. What would I learn to bring back and use in my teaching and practice here? The number one thing is flexibility. I mean, the idea of, like I was saying, with the way we treat things and really medicalize things, okay, isn't necessarily the right way to do things. So we had 2 patients, because as an aside, it was Ramadan while we were there, and it's a highly Muslim area, and so very, very strict practitioners in that area during Ramadan wouldn't take anything by mouth from sunrise to sunset, including their medications. And so if you're not eating and you're not taking your diabetic medications on the regularly scheduled times, it does all sorts of weird things with your blood sugar. So we had 2 separate cases of diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a pretty severe complication of uncontrolled diabetes, come into the clinic while we were there. And the fact that both of them, it took longer, but they got better with what we would call negligent care in the United States, really shows that there's a high range of things that can be effective. The big project that we were working on as a group to help with the clinic was focused on maternal child health. And the medical providers, the physicians, the residents who were in the group, their focus was on getting patients in for prenatal visits, what needed to be done and what visits needed to happen. Here in the United States, everybody goes in monthly during their first trimester and a half to 2 trimesters, and then every 2 weeks until you're about 4 weeks out, and then weekly you get your visits, even if everything's uncomplicated and there are no real issues. There's not necessarily a whole lot of good data indicating that that has to happen for every pregnant mom. People don't have access or the ability to come in to get prenatal care there. So it was a matter of distilling down what needs to be done and what can we do to get people in. And the big thing they could do to get people in was they had an ultrasound machine. If you can show women their babies, they really want to come in and see them. And so that would get them in. And so we came up with a series, I think it was 5 visits overall, to really try and get some of the critical things that needed to be monitored and the information that needed to be given to moms to help ensure that they're going to have more likely to have a healthy pregnancy. So flexibility in terms of how you manage things, that is directly translatable to what you do here. So you have a lot of people in a lot of challenging situations here in the United States, be it in rural areas that don't have access to hospitals or don't have access to the most cutting edge care, or be it in people with socioeconomic difficulties who can't pay for care, who don't have access to medications and things. And figuring out how can you make do with what you've got and work for the best outcomes that you can get, using the resources that you have available to you is hugely beneficial. Yeah?
There and in Borneo, what is the average life expectancy, and is it increasing? Is it staying the same, decreasing?
Yeah, life expectancy. I don't remember the exact numbers. I know that it is increasing, and I know that about 30 years ago it was around 45, and now it's up to somewhere around 60-ish, but I don't remember for sure exactly where that is. So it has been increasing over time. Yeah?
Do they have access to contraceptions, or is there a value placed on the number of children you have?
There is a definite value placed on the number of children you have. So contraceptives are available. They had free condoms at the clinic that they were giving out. The government, I believe, I may be incorrect in this, but I believe the government also provides free condoms available for people through the government health clinics. But no, there is definite value. And so in one case on a mobile clinic that I went on, there was a young lady who came into the clinic and she had a seizure disorder. And was asking us what medications could she take that would have the lowest risk for her if she were to get pregnant, or lowest risk for the development of the pregnancy. Because if she did not get pregnant within the next year, her husband was going to leave her, because that was what the purpose of being married was. And so it's not widespread. There's still very high numbers of children per family. And part of that is driven in part still, I think, by there's still a relatively high infant mortality rate. And so there are lots of issues that go into that, but contraceptives are available. They are not commonly used. Did you have another question?
Does
Do you think technology has potential to impact significantly within the next generation, like telemedicine kind of thing?
It already is impacting. So in the clinic there, they had wireless internet access. And so we could access all of the resources that we typically use for the most part. It was hit or miss. It would sometimes go out. But you could still access resources for education and information. And so that made just a huge difference in terms of the quality of care when you're having to figure out, okay, what medications do we have? If we don't have the recommended medications to treat this particular problem, what's something that could work instead? And being able to access those resources. They had a portable ultrasound, which is hugely valuable, that didn't have a decade ago. So those sorts of things already are starting to make it out into the smaller areas and are going to have dramatic impacts on the care. Yeah. Yes?
What's your assessment of the impact of this organization in terms of reversing deforestation?
In the immediate area around the national park, they've actually made a pretty significant difference. So I think they've got, I want to say it's about 12 villages now of the 16 or 18 that surround the park that have signed on and have agreed to stop logging within the park. And so there has been a local impact. Now, in terms of the difference that makes in the overall deforestation, it's very little. It's a drop in the bucket, So it really is providing local benefit, but the benefit is really much greater toward individual health care in the area than it is toward the overall problem of deforestation. Other questions?
Well, thank you so much. Oh, you got a question?
Oh, yeah.
One more. Okay.
Yeah, so I was just curious. So I'm just wondering how common it is for people to become doctors, or how often do students choose to become doctors in this country?
I have no idea how often students choose to become doctors. I would assume it's fairly similar. Well, it's as in a lot of areas in the world, it's a prestigious field to go into, and so there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of interest in it. They have expanded training recently, but the training system, it only has a limited capacity. And so that's where a lot of the corruption comes in, where people are paying to get in, regardless of qualifications and that sort of thing. But I can't say in terms of the population and what percentage choose to go into medicine or other health-related fields.
Okay, yeah. Sounds like midwives are pretty common.
Midwives are pretty common, but they're lay trained. And so, they, like I said, I think earlier, that they do have a nurse midwife that was working at the hospital, but the lay, I mean, that's just local healthcare economy and education system there. It's not through any sort of government-sponsored or formalized education process.
Well, thank you, Darren. I think that, the quality of the questions that you got today and your response indicates there's a lot of interest in your talk, and people learned a lot. The thing that I particularly like about this presentation is it shows how some people from Missoula are doing some amazing things in other parts of the world, and that's what this lecture series is all about. And so we're thankful for you coming to talk to us tonight, but even more so for organizing those trips and keeping them going, because I guess it's going to go again. And,
the plan is annual.
Man, wonderful. So please join me in thanking Darren Bell for a great presentation. Just hang on for a minute. I want to tell you about what's coming up next week. So next week we've got a really special talk from, I have to say this, one of my favorite students. Joe Carlson is going to talk about the experience he had last summer working as an intern in India through the IE3 program. And he's going to, title of his talk is Chaotic Fluidity, Perceptions from a Rural Health Internship. So please come and listen to Joe. He's really a great guy, and he's lots to talk about in terms of the amazing experience he had in India. See you next week.